Welcome to Have You Heard, where we talk about issues at the intersection of agriculture and engineering. Let's get started. Here are your hosts, Morgan Hayes and Josh Jackson.
Welcome. This is the Have You Heard podcast. This is episode 32. We're going to talk today about state cost share. I'm Morgan Hayes. I'm an assistant professor in Biosystems and Ag Engineering, focusing on livestock facilities. And in my personal life, my husband and I farm in Boyle County, Kentucky. We farm about 500 acres. It's a commercial cattle and hay operation.
I'm Josh Jackson. I'm also an assistant professor in Biosystems and Agriculture Engineering. And I focus on precision livestock farming. In my personal life, we raise registering as cattle and focus on some hay production.
Okay, Josh. So before we get started into today's topic, state cost share monies that we've received and projects we've done, let's talk a little bit more about what's been going on the farms this week.
So we've been actually doing some soil sampling. We got a little bit of rain this past Sunday. So a little bit, about 1.5 inches of rain in Mercer County. And so it's kind of helped return everything to the growth stage at least. And so we did soil sampling just in case, the fertilizer prices go down and we're able to maybe apply some this fall potentially. And then, pretty much all of our equipment from the first cutting, any repairs, we're doing a lot of repairs. We're building a cutter bar. So a lot going on, just trying to get everything repaired, ready to go for this next cut, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good goal. I think this has been a pretty wild year, but I'm optimistic too that we might get some fertilizer on here in the fall, or at least in the spring. Starting to anticipate that though, and getting soil samples is probably a great idea. We've been focusing on bringing in hay that was baled in late June, later first cutting hays, just enough to get ourselves where we need to be in terms of total quantity. We now have 3 of our 5 hoop barns are completely full.
Okay.
And we have hay in the other 2, but those are not full yet. And then we have some outdoor hay that's tarped on one of our farms to feed our cattle. So that puts us in a very good position going into winter in case water does not turn back on fully here this summer. Or if just that generally this heat has been pretty tough on some of our cooler season grasses. So some of our pastures and hayfields are maybe not as productive as they sometimes are. They may be a little bit slow to pick back up in the fall after the dry spell and the warm weather we've had the last few weeks. So I think we're in pretty good shape there. Also, our tractor that had been down has been fixed. That's a big thank you to our mechanic who got that done for us. That means that the tractor will be ready for second cutting hay. We haven't picked it up yet, but that's a huge relief to have that off of our to-do list currently.
Right.
We still certainly have other maintenance to do on a few things, but most of our equipment that we would need for second cutting of hay is now ready to go again. And aside from that, we've just been doing general rotation on our animals, managing them. We have a couple bred cows that are due to calve in the fall that we're going to get ready to sell. So we're taking pictures of those and getting ready to list them for sale.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
those bred cows, you're going to sell them just as bred, not cow calves, or?
I think we'll try and sell them as bred cows. We know that they're an August 15th to an October 15th calving date. That's our window. If for some reason they don't sell, we may calve them out and sell them as pairs. Honestly, the market is what it is right now. It's very strong for cull cows right now.
Right.
I'm hesitant to sell pairs through the stockyards because what tends to happen is people tend to buy and break them up, and which is okay. I understand why people do that, but I don't love selling a young calf that's not really weaned yet through the stockyards if I don't need to and the mother's not failing at her job. It's not ideal. And none of these cows are in poor enough condition that would be necessary. But if I could sell them as a cow-calf pair off the farm to another farm, great. If we can sell them before they calve here, right at the very beginning of August, that would be ideal.
Huh.
And if I have to keep them into the fall a little bit, I can. It's not a deal breaker. They are on a farm that has enough grass to maintain them for the remainder of summer.
Okay.
So
shouldn't be too bad.
That's where we're at. We're just figuring things out as usual, trying to make money, trying not to lose our...
Try not to lose too much.
That's right. So that's what's been happening on the farms. But our topic today is maybe a little bit unrelated to what we just talked about, but is very much tied to the topic we did 2 weeks ago, the last time we recorded, and that is cost share programs. And in this case, we're talking about state cost share programs. And in Kentucky, we say state cost share. It's actually state conservation money that's done for projects that are very similar to the NRCS projects we spoke about last week. The difference is the state cost share has a little bit more flexibility in it, I think, than the EQIP program in terms of meeting specifications. It can be a little bit more site specific, although they too have drawings that they have to match. That money is usually managed either through an NRCS or a soil conservation office, depending on the county and how they manage those funds. But it is another option for cost share, and it's one that we've used on our farm. I don't know if you have on yours.
Yep, we've used it as well. And I think the funding is actually a little bit different as well. The funding percentages.
Yeah, it's a 75-25 split. So they provide 75% of the funding and you provide 25%. And it has a smaller total dollar limit on it. So used to be $7,500. It's currently, I think, somewhere around 20,000-ish. I'm not absolutely certain on that top dollar amount in a given year. But these are maybe slightly smaller projects than EQIP projects have the opportunity to be much larger in scale or small in scale. The EQIP could go over a broad range, but these ones are certainly tied down to a maximum dollar amount that's a little bit smaller than what EQIP is. So, but there are certainly some pretty nice projects you can get done under that $20,000 cap.
I think a lot of times what we've used it for, at least my family has used it for, is feeding pads.
Yeah.
So getting some concrete feeding pads and also some just gravel feeding pads. So just something out there. So a little less tearing up. So for our sacrifice field, you're not tearing up your whole entire farm trying to put out hay.
Yeah, we've always used it as well for our winter. We have had 2 winter feeding areas, concreted winter feeding areas that we've paid for that way. And we've also used that state cost share money for a rotational system, so waterers and fencing. But because of that dollar limit, it tends to be a smaller farm that would be more accessible to put in a rotational system. A rotational system on a 100-acre farm, that $20,000 cap might not get you all the waterers and fence lines you need, interior fence lines you need for a rotational system. But on, say, a farm that was maybe 50 acres or less, it might be a much more viable,
much more appropriate size project.
Yeah. So that's a real benefit, is that we have the opportunity to do some projects on some smaller farms, and still pretty large projects, but maybe a little bit more flexibility. So for us, we were able to do a slightly different design on our concrete feeding area. I think most now that they're asking for is flat concrete work in general, where the typical design that we see a lot of people putting in on their winter feeding areas with concrete involve putting posts in the ground and things like that. The state cost share money will allow just a flat sheet of concrete to be poured, a flat pour, and then allow you to build on top of it if you need to. It similarly will allow you to put posts into it, but it has the flexibility of just being able to do a flat pour rather than having to put in the post system and then also the feed panels.
Right. And I know ours is, we had ours in our alley for the feeding lane, at least, pretty much designed to be as wide as our skid steer, pretty much. So
Yeah.
we're able to go down through there and load up about a week's worth of hay for our cattle. So even though we'll feed 40-ish mamas in there, 40, I think it can handle up to 60 potentially. But we'll feed 40 and we'll put at least 10 bales, 10 5x6 bales in there.
That's a pretty large pad, a pretty large feeding area. In fact, that's one of the differences probably, is that you can put that many bales in there, but if it was on an NRCS project, the specification would only allow you to put in 30 feet or so of feeding area, so you'd be limited down to
6 bales.
6-ish bales. And in this case, you can put 10 in the way you have the facility designed, which is not necessarily hugely different, but it does maybe make the system a little more flexible, the design a little more flexible on farms. So there are some reasons that you might consider state cost share over NRCS cost share programs. Both of them have their place, but it is very interesting to see how they're used. The other thing is we have a rotational system in there, and it's a small enough rotational system. It would have been hard to probably fund it as an equip project with NRCS. It's not a large enough project to maybe get funded very quickly, but we were able to get it funded through the state cost share fairly quickly. And that was really nice. That allowed us to put in 4 water tanks. And it also allowed us to put in a little over a mile of interior fencing. So it was a pretty nice project for us on a smaller operation that we own. And certainly gave us some.
Still a mile of fencing, still a significant project.
It's a lot of work. In this case, it was a lot of smaller fence lines, and there were some existing fence lines that were able to tie into some new fence lines. And but it's a nice little project. It would be a little bit more challenging on some of the other programs to get all of that done. But in this case, it was a perfect opportunity. I've also seen people put in heavy use pads around water tanks, heavy use pads for mineral feeders, heavy use through gates.
Yep.
So this money, I think, tends to also get spread out to some of those projects that would be maybe too small to get easily funded through NRCS programming, but have real benefit on farm, or a graveled waterway, water access points on ponds. All of those things are things that we might potentially be able to fund, which is kind of nice.
Those heavy use areas through gates, I think it can be especially important when you're going through in the wintertime. We had a couple where the cattle would go through, tractor would go through, and you would just be spinning your wheels in essence.
Yeah, where those areas that they get torn up really badly in those gate areas.
This is a concentrated point.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's even that it was already built once, so you're just repairing something. And sometimes we can use different funding sources. So we'll talk next week or 2 weeks from now, because we have ASABE next week, a conference for our professional society next week. But in 2 weeks, we'll talk a little bit about CAPE funding, which is another spot where you might fund smaller projects like this. But all of these smaller projects are sometimes hard to come up with the money for, but they're extremely useful on farm from a management perspective and also from an environmental perspective. We can create a lot of erosion, a lot of deterioration in ground cover at our gateways if we're not careful. And we can even get like calves and stuff stuck in the mud in those areas, and it's very hard to manage that if we don't have that gravel pad. But sometimes it's hard to justify the investment you have to make to get it right.
And plus, sometimes even the equipment, I was thinking equipment, but even the cattle, like you were saying, won't want to go through a gate system, or won't move as easily just because they know they have to struggle to get through it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we too have had years where we've had animals have to walk through an area that they don't want to go through. And if you need to get a cow up, let's say she's injured or something else is happening, or she's a spring calver, so it's mid-March, sometimes it's very hard to push them up to a working facility if they have to go through an area that's been deteriorated all winter and is really tough for the animal to walk through anyway. Getting them to push through there when they're not feeling well is even more challenging.
It's even more of a challenge. So you got an animal who's sick and not feeling well, then having to struggle to get through. Adds insult to injury almost.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really nice opportunity to do that. I'm trying to think if I know of any other programs. I think people have also done some things with reseeding some pastures and stuff, although I've never utilized the program for that purpose.
There's some pasture renovation, I think, projects.
Yeah, so a lot of opportunities there for different types of projects.
And it's just being able to take advantage of them, I think.
Absolutely. So those state cost share dollars, though, I think are maybe not as well advertised as the NRCS programs. And I think people who are knowledgeable know about a lot of these programs, but it's really worthwhile to go talk to your local soil conservation office and your local NRCS office and find out what programs are available, and then just be in sort of regular contact with them, because As I said before, sometimes the funding is very different.
Yep.
For some of these programs. And it changes from year to year. So you sort of have to come back and talk to people again and again,
And be
or
flexible.
at least make sure they know what's happening so that they know if you're interested in certain programs, that when they become available, that they know to contact you.
Right.
So, okay. Well, with that, let's go ahead and just talk a little bit about what's happening on the farm next week. I alluded to the fact that you and I are both traveling next week to a conference. So how does that affect what's happening on the farm next week?
Pretty much just getting everything prepared for my brothers to take over and just take care of the farm. It should be, just to run on impulse power for right now. We don't have any hay to cut, so it's just maintain fence lines, maintain moving cattle, and maybe get ready for the next big rotation. We're actually going to throw them into our fall group into hayfield potentially.
Okay. Yeah, and I'm traveling as well next week, and actually my husband's coming with me on this trip. So that is unusual for us that we would both be off the farm at one time. So we have some help coming in to do some feeding, but we have spent the last couple days, and we'll spend the next couple days, next day and a half or so, making sure that everything is set up to be as low a labor demand as possible and as least likely to have issues as possible. Making sure animals all have fresh pastures, everything gets rotated, making sure that the next rotation they would go into, if for some reason they don't get a full week out of that one, which is possible with how dry it's been, although hopefully with that little bit of rain and a little more possibly coming next week, we might be able to stretch them out to that full week that we usually expect off of our rotational system. So making sure minerals out, making sure all the water tanks are in good shape, making sure every feed bin is full enough, and
So pretty much fail safe in the entire system.
we
Fail-safe.
are doing everything in our power to make sure things do not go terribly awry while we're both gone.
Yeah. I mean, it's what you got to do when you have a farm. It's just
I mean, you would think you'd have to do that all the time, but you accept a certain level of chaos when you are the one feeding.
and entropy.
You become much more anxious if you're not the one that's going to handle the chaos when it shows up in the middle of the week. So
Yes.
fortunately, my parents and in-laws are both going to be around, and while neither of them typically does all the feeding, both of them know the farms well enough to be able to at least know who to call if there's a major issue.
Okay. And assist
So.
each other.
Yes, or call us. They might be calling us, but that will be okay as well. So.
Yep.
And with that, I think that's our podcast for the day. We'll come back not next week, but the following week, which will be very end of July, and we'll talk about the last cost share program, which is CAPE here in Kentucky. It's a cost share program that we'll talk about more than. It's a smaller program, but it's a county run program that I think has a lot of benefits as well.
A lot of huge benefits across the state. All right. Thanks
We'll
for joining
see that.
us.
Thank you.